Let's begin with something many people feel but struggle to admit out loud. Inconsistency is not confusion, it's information. When someone only shows up when it's convenient for them, what you're witnessing isn't a mystery to solve, it's a pattern to understand. We often tell ourselves stories to soften that reality. We say they're busy, they're overwhelmed, they're going through something. And to be fair, life does get complicated. People have responsibilities, stress, emotional limitations. But care has a way of making itself visible even in the middle of chaos. When someone genuinely values you, you don't have to constantly question where you stand in their life. You feel it in the consistency of their presence, in the small efforts that don't require reminders, in the way they choose to stay connected even when it's not easy. What makes this dynamic so difficult is that inconsistency can feel like hope. When someone disappears and then suddenly reappears with attention, warmth, or affection, it creates a cycle that's emotionally addictive. You start to hold onto the highs and justify the lows. You begin to measure the relationship not by its overall pattern, but by its best moments. And that's where we lose clarity. There's a psychological principle at play here: intermittent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that keeps people hooked on unpredictable rewards. When affection or attention is given unpredictably, it actually strengthens attachment, even when the overall experience is unsatisfying. So you're not weak for struggling to let go of someone inconsistent. You're responding exactly the way the human brain is wired to respond. But understanding that mechanism also gives you power. It allows you to step back and evaluate the relationship not based on how it feels in isolated moments, but on what it consistently provides over time. And here's the deeper question: why do we tolerate inconsistency in the first place? Often, it has less to do with the other person and more to do with our relationship with ourselves. When we're not fully grounded in our own sense of worth, we become more willing to accept partial presence. We convince ourselves that something is better than nothing, that occasional attention is enough, that we shouldn't ask for too much. But the truth is, asking for consistency isn't asking for perfection. It's asking for respect. There's a kind of quiet erosion that happens when you stay in relationships like this. You start adjusting your expectations downward. You celebrate basic decency as if it were extraordinary effort. You hesitate to express your needs because you don't want to seem demanding. And over time, you lose touch with what healthy connection actually looks like. This is how self-abandonment begins, not in dramatic moments, but in small, repeated decisions to accept less than what you know you deserve. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that people who only show up when it's convenient tend to engage on their own terms. They reach out when they need something: comfort, validation, distraction. But they're often unavailable when you need the same in return. The relationship becomes asymmetrical. You give stability, they offer unpredictability. You invest emotionally, they participate selectively. And yet, because they show up just enough, it creates the illusion of reciprocity. But real care isn't selective. It doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. It leans in, especially in those moments. Not perfectly, not without limitations, but with intention. Care is demonstrated through reliability, through follow-through, through the willingness to be present even when there's nothing to gain. And that kind of presence can't be faked over time. It either exists or it doesn't. There's also a subtle but important distinction between someone who can't show up consistently and someone who won't. Capacity matters. People go through seasons where they genuinely don't have the emotional resources to be fully present. But when that's the case, there's usually honesty about it. There's communication, accountability, and acknowledgement of the gap. What you don't see is repeated disappearance without explanation, followed by casual re-entry as if nothing happened. That's not a lack of capacity. That's a lack of consideration. Learning to recognize this difference is part of developing emotional clarity. And emotional clarity is essential for self-respect, because once you see the pattern for what it is, you're faced with a choice. You can continue to engage with it, hoping it will change, or you can decide that your time, energy, and emotional well-being are too valuable to be managed around someone else's convenience. This isn't about blaming or judging the other person. It's about being honest with yourself. People are allowed to be who they are. They're allowed to have their limitations, their priorities, their way of relating. But you are also allowed to decide what kind of behavior you're willing to accept in your life. And that decision is where your power lies. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether someone occasionally shows up for you. The question is whether they show up in a way that feels stable, respectful, and real. And if the answer is no, then the most important shift isn't trying to change them. It's choosing not to keep adjusting yourself to fit a pattern that consistently leaves you uncertain. Consistency is not a luxury in relationships. It's a foundation, and anything built without a foundation will eventually require you to hold it up on your own. So if you find yourself constantly waiting, wondering, or making excuses for someone's absence, pause and ask yourself a simple but uncomfortable question. Am I experiencing care, or am I experiencing convenience? There's another layer to this conversation that's even more subtle and often more damaging over time. It's not just about whether someone shows up. It's about how they respond when you do. Because real connection isn't measured only in presence. It's measured in emotional safety. And one of the clearest signs that someone doesn't truly care about you is how they handle your feelings when you choose to express them. Think about what it takes to be emotionally honest, to say, "That hurt me," or "I felt overlooked," or even "I need more from this." That kind of vulnerability is not casual. It requires courage. It requires a willingness to be seen without knowing how the other person will respond. And in healthy relationships, that risk is met with care. Not necessarily agreement, not immediate perfection, but a genuine effort to understand. But when someone consistently minimizes or dismisses your feelings, something very different happens. The conversation shifts away from understanding and moves toward control. You might hear things like, "You're overreacting," or "It's not that serious," or "You always make things bigger than they are." And in those moments, the issue is no longer what you felt. It becomes whether you were even allowed to feel it in the first place. This is where emotional invalidation begins to take root. And it's important to understand that invalidation doesn't always look harsh or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the lack of response, the change of subject, the silence that follows your honesty. Sometimes it's disguised as logic or rationality, where your emotions are treated as obstacles rather than information. Over time, these small moments accumulate, and they start to reshape how you see yourself. You begin to second-guess your own emotional reality. You wonder if you're too sensitive, too demanding, too much. You hesitate before speaking, filtering your thoughts, softening your truth just to avoid being dismissed again. And without realizing it, you start to abandon parts of yourself, not because they're wrong, but because they're unwelcome. This is one of the most profound consequences of being in a relationship where your feelings are not respected. It doesn't just affect the connection, it affects your identity, because our emotions are not random or meaningless. They are signals. They tell us when something matters, when something feels off, when a boundary has been crossed. And when those signals are consistently ignored or invalidated, we lose access to an essential part of our internal guidance system. There's a concept often explored in the work of Brené Brown, the idea that vulnerability is the foundation of meaningful connection. But vulnerability without safety doesn't create connection. It creates exposure. And exposure without care leads to withdrawal. This is why people who experience repeated invalidation often stop sharing altogether, not because they don't have feelings, but because they've learned that expressing them comes at a cost. And here's where the distinction becomes critical. Someone doesn't have to agree with your feelings to respect them. Understanding and agreement are not the same thing. A person can see the world differently, interpret events differently, and still say, "I hear you. I can see why that affected you. Your experience matters." That's what emotional maturity looks like. It's the ability to hold space for another person's reality, even when it doesn't perfectly align with your own. When that's missing, the relationship becomes emotionally one-sided. One person is allowed to feel, while the other is expected to suppress. One person defines what is valid, while the other adapts, and that imbalance creates a quiet but persistent form of disconnection. Because you can't feel close to someone who doesn't truly see you, and you can't feel safe with someone who makes you question your own inner world. It's also worth acknowledging that many people who invalidate others are not doing so with malicious intent. Often, it comes from their own discomfort with emotions, their own lack of tools, their own learned patterns. But understanding the origin of a behavior doesn't mean you have to accept its impact. You can have compassion for someone's limitations and still recognize that those limitations are not healthy for you. The deeper work here is not just identifying invalidation, but deciding what you will do when you encounter it. Will you continue to explain yourself, hoping to be understood by someone who has shown little willingness to understand? Or will you begin to honor your own experience, even if it means stepping back from the relationship? Because self-worth is not built on being agreed with, it's built on being aligned with your own truth. It's the quiet confidence that your feelings are valid, not because someone else approves of them, but because they are yours. And when you reach that place, something shifts. You stop negotiating your reality just to maintain connection. You stop shrinking your voice to fit someone else's comfort. You begin to recognize that being heard is not a privilege in a relationship. It's a basic requirement. And if that requirement is consistently unmet, then the issue is no longer communication, it's compatibility. At the end of the day, the question is not whether someone occasionally listens to you. The question is whether they create a space where you can exist fully, where your thoughts, your emotions, your experiences are treated with respect, even when they're inconvenient or uncomfortable. Because the right people in your life won't make you feel like your emotions are a problem to solve. They'll treat them as a part of you worth understanding. And if you have to keep convincing someone to care about how you feel, then you're not asking for too much. You're asking the wrong person. There comes a point in certain relationships where, if you're honest with yourself, you begin to notice a pattern that's difficult to ignore. You're the one initiating the conversations. You're the one checking in, following up, trying to resolve tension before it turns into distance. You're the one apologizing first, even when you're not entirely sure what you're apologizing for. And over time, what started as effort begins to feel like maintenance, like you're single, handedly holding something together that should be standing on its own. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. In fact, it can feel like strength. You tell yourself you're being patient, understanding, emotionally mature. You take pride in your ability to communicate, to repair, to keep things from falling apart. But there's a quiet line between healthy effort and chronic overfunctioning. And when you cross that line, the relationship stops being mutual and starts becoming dependent on your willingness to carry it. This is where imbalance takes root, not in obvious ways, but in repeated patterns of who shows up and who compensates. One person becomes the stabilizer, the emotional anchor, the one who absorbs the weight of disconnection and tries to turn it back into connection. The other becomes passive, reactive, or even indifferent, knowing consciously or not that the relationship will continue because you won't let it fail. And that's the part we rarely talk about, how overgiving can unintentionally enable underparticipation. When you consistently step in to fix, to initiate, to smooth things over, you remove the necessity for the other person to do the same. The relationship adapts around your effort. It becomes structured in a way where your energy is the constant and theirs is optional. From a psychological perspective, this dynamic often reflects deeper patterns. Some people are conditioned to equate love with effort, to believe that the more they give, the more meaningful the connection becomes. Others have learned to avoid emotional responsibility, relying on the other person to carry the relational load. And when these two patterns meet, they can create a system that feels stable on the surface, but is fundamentally unbalanced underneath. The cost of this imbalance is not immediate. It accumulates. It shows up as emotional exhaustion, as quiet resentment, as a growing sense that something isn't being reciprocated, but you can't quite name it without feeling guilty, because part of you still believes that if you just try a little harder, communicate a little better, give a little more, things will shift. But sustainable relationships are not built on one person's endurance. They're built on shared responsibility. And shared responsibility means that both people are invested not just in the connection, but in maintaining it. It means that effort flows in both directions, not always equally in every moment, but consistently over time. There's an important idea often reflected in conversations about vulnerability and connection, including those shaped by voices like Brené Brown, that true belonging doesn't require you to betray yourself to stay connected. And yet, that's exactly what happens when you're the only one holding things together. You begin to override your own needs for the sake of preserving the relationship. You tolerate silence where there should be communication. You accept distance where there should be presence. You minimize your own expectations to match someone else's level of involvement. And slowly, without a clear moment of decision, you start to disappear from your own experience, not completely, not dramatically, but in small ways. You stop asking for what you need because it feels like too much. You stop expecting follow-through because you've adapted to inconsistency. You stop noticing how one-sided things have become because it's easier than confronting what that might mean. But here's the reality. Relationships reveal themselves not in what is said, but in what is sustained. Anyone can express care in moments. Anyone can show up occasionally, say the right things, make temporary efforts. But what defines a relationship is not its intensity. It's its consistency and reciprocity. If you are always the one bridging the gap, then the gap is not being closed. It's being managed. And managing a gap is not the same as building a connection. There's also a deeper question underneath all of this, and it's one that requires a level of honesty that can be uncomfortable. What are you afraid will happen if you stop trying so hard? For many people, The answer is loss. The fear that if they stop initiating, the conversation will end. If they stop fixing, the relationship will fall apart, and in a way, that fear is pointing you toward the truth. Because a relationship that depends entirely on your effort is not being sustained by mutual care. It's being sustained by your reluctance to let it go. And that realization is not a failure, it's clarity. Because once you see that you've been the one holding everything together, you're given an opportunity not to force the other person to change, but to change your own role within the dynamic. To step back, to stop overfunctioning, to allow the relationship to reveal what it actually is without your constant intervention. And that's where things become real, because what remains when you stop doing all the work tells you everything you need to know. If the connection weakens or disappears, it doesn't mean you didn't try hard enough. It means the relationship was never equally held to begin with. And while that can be painful, it's also freeing, because it redirects your energy away from sustaining something unbalanced and toward creating space for something mutual. You are not meant to carry a relationship on your own. You are not meant to earn consistency through effort or prove your worth through endurance. Connection is not something you force into existence. It's something that is co-created, moment by two people who are both willing to show up. So if you find yourself constantly holding things together, pause and consider what that effort is actually maintaining. Is it a relationship built on shared care, or a pattern built on your willingness to keep it alive? Because the moment you stop overextending yourself is the moment you find out who was really standing with you all along.